Imagine a city where people line up to buy cakes that do not even exist yet. They pay in full, cash up front. But instead of using that money to bake their cake, the bakery uses it to open 3 more shops across town. Then it uses tomorrow's cake money to pay yesterday's flour bill. For a while, everybody looks rich. The stores are packed. The signs are glowing. The owner gets praised like a business genius. Then one day, the music cuts out, the ovens go cold, and millions of people realize they were never really buying cake at all. They were financing a chain reaction. That, in the simplest possible terms, is the Evergrande story. And to understand why one property company sent shockwaves through China's economy, you have to understand one thing first. Evergrande was never just a company. It was a machine built to run on confidence. And confidence is the one fuel that disappears the second people smell smoke. For years, China's property market looked like the safest game in town. Families were not just buying homes to live in. Homes became savings accounts, status symbols, retirement plans, and proof that life was moving in the right direction. Developers rushed to feed that demand. Local governments sold land. Banks handed out loans. Buyers paid for apartments before the buildings were even finished. And because the whole system kept moving, it all started to feel normal. But here is the twist. It only looked safe because everyone was standing on the same thin sheet of ice at the exact same time. The property sector and related industries grew so massive that they made up roughly a quarter of China's economy. That meant housing was no longer just housing. It became a giant economic engine. And when that engine was humming, everything around it looked strong. But when it even started to cough, the whole country could feel the vibration. Evergrande mastered this model better than almost anyone. It grew into China's biggest developer, and eventually the most indebted property company on Earth, piling up around $300 billion in liabilities. On paper, it looked enormous. In reality, it was stretched thin, like a man juggling 10 plates while standing on a ladder made of borrowed wood. It bought land, launched projects, sold apartments before they were finished, borrowed more, and expanded again. As long as fresh money kept coming in, the machine kept spinning. That is the part a lot of people miss. Evergrande was not simply building homes. It was constantly reaching into the future and dragging tomorrow's cash into today. In a very real sense, it was living several years ahead of its actual wallet. As long as home prices kept rising and buyers believed the next apartment would be worth more than the last one, that trick looked like brilliance. But when growth slows down, the exact same trick starts looking less like genius and more like a magic act with no stage beneath it. Here is the simple version of the business model. A developer launches Project A and collects money from buyers. But instead of using all that money to finish Project A, it uses part of it to start Project B and Project C. Then it borrows against land, future sales, and whatever confidence still exists in the market. If buyers keep buying, the company can always say, "Relax, the money is coming." But here's the catch. The money was almost always coming from the next promise, not from the last success. That works beautifully in a boom because every new sale hides the weakness behind the old one. But the moment buyers hesitate, the whole thing turns brutally honest. Suddenly, you can see which buildings are half finished, which bills are unpaid, and which empire was built less like a house and more like a bicycle that could never stop moving without tipping over. By 2020, Chinese authorities were getting nervous. Developers had become too dependent on debt, too large, and too dangerous to ignore. So regulators imposed borrowing limits known as the 3 red lines, meant to stop the binge. In plain English, Beijing looked at the sector and basically said, "You need to stop living on borrowed money." The idea made sense. Slow the borrowing, force discipline, reduce the risk. But here is the twist. This was like telling a man who had been sprinting downhill for years to stop instantly on loose gravel. The policy helped trigger a liquidity crunch starting in the middle of 2021, because these companies were never built for slow, healthy growth. They were built to be constantly fed. Once borrowing tightened, the old machine started starving. And when a property developer starts starving, it does not just miss a target or disappoint investors. It stops projects, delays payments, rattles buyers, and starts broadcasting weakness across the entire market. Then came the second blow. Confidence cracked. Sales weakened. The broader economy lost momentum. Even after COVID controls were lifted, the old appetite never really came roaring back. Buyers who once rushed into pre-sales started asking a much more dangerous question. Will this apartment ever actually be finished? That question is poison in a system built on trust. Evergrande defaulted on offshore debt in late 2021 and became the face of the wider property crisis. The company had already been wobbling, but that default turned wobbling into collapse. Suddenly, the developer everyone knew was no longer a giant builder. It was a giant warning sign. And once the public sees a warning sign, it does not calmly keep shopping. It freezes. It waits. It steps back. In finance, fear spreads faster than facts. A rumor can start a panic. A missed payment can rewrite an entire industry's reputation. Evergrande managed to do both. This is where the story stops being about investors and balance sheets and starts becoming painfully human. Families had paid for homes years earlier. Some had paid in full. Some were already making mortgage payments on properties they still could not live in. But the homes were still nothing more than skeletons of concrete and rebar behind construction fences. In one stalled Evergrande project in Shijiazhuang, buyers who had paid years before were still waiting, and the project had promised around 1,800 homes. Across China, anger spread as buyers threatened to stop paying mortgages on unfinished apartments. Reports at the time showed protests linked to more than 100 developments in a matter of days. But here's the twist. The biggest threat was no longer just the developer's debt. It was the moral fracture in the entire deal. The unwritten promise of the housing market is simple. If you pay, you get a home. Once people stop believing that, the problem becomes much bigger than construction. It becomes a crisis of trust. And when trust breaks in housing, the damage does not stay in housing. Banks start worrying about bad loans. Suppliers stop getting paid. Construction workers vanish from job sites. Families delay spending because their wealth is trapped inside unfinished boxes of concrete. Investors stop believing glossy promises. The market, which used to run on momentum, starts running on suspicion. Analysts cited by Reuters estimated there were around 20 million unfinished homes across China left by Evergrande and other failed developers, with a funding gap of about $446 billion needed to complete them. Read that again. This was not one broken tower in one city. This was a nationwide overhang pressing down on household wealth, consumer confidence, and economic growth. The property crisis became a drag on the broader economy because the old growth model had tied so many jobs, so many savings, and so many hopes to the idea that apartments would always be sold, always be finished, and always keep rising in value. Evergrande spent years trying to escape the trap. It worked on an offshore debt restructuring plan worth roughly $23 billion. Hearings were delayed. Creditors argued. The company searched desperately for more time. But buying time was the one thing it had been doing all along, and now, time had become painfully expensive. In January 2024, a Hong Kong court ordered Evergrande to liquidate after the company failed to produce a viable restructuring plan. That was a dramatic moment, but here is the twist. Liquidation sounds like an ending, when in reality it was just the beginning of a long, ugly cleanup. Judges can order liquidation. They cannot magically pour concrete, restore trust, or hand keys to families who have been waiting for years. The legal process itself was expected to drag on for years, and even then the real-world questions remained exactly the same. Who finishes the homes? Who absorbs the losses? And who convinces buyers that this nightmare will not happen all over again? Chinese authorities did try to stabilize the damage. Regulators pledged to help local governments guarantee the delivery of homes. Officials rolled out support measures, project whitelists, and financing steps meant to keep construction alive wherever possible. Even the 3 red lines policy that helped trigger the crisis was reportedly dropped in early 2026. But here is the twist. Policy can reopen the water valve, yet it cannot force thirsty people to drink. Analysts said the property sector's funding challenges would continue even after the formal borrowing limits were removed, because the deeper problem was never just access to credit. It was confidence. People were not refusing to buy because they forgot how mortgages work. They were refusing because they had watched giant developers fail, watched projects stall, and watched prices keep slipping. Once people believe the floor is moving under their feet, cheaper loans are not enough. They want proof. They want delivery. They want certainty. And that is why the Evergrande story matters far beyond China. On the surface, it is about one over-leveraged developer. Underneath, it is about what happens when a country's favorite growth machine starts confusing motion with strength. The model looked brilliant during the boom years because rising prices covered every weakness. Borrow more, build more, sell more, repeat. But a system built on endless tomorrow can only survive as long as tomorrow keeps arriving on schedule. The moment tomorrow shows up late, the math gets ugly fast. The company that once symbolized unstoppable growth becomes the symbol of a deeper truth. Some booms are not wealth being created. They are confidence being borrowed. And borrowed confidence is like borrowed oxygen. It feels normal right up until the room goes quiet. Then suddenly everyone understands the problem at the same time. So if you want the entire Evergrande collapse in one sentence, here it is. China spent years building a housing engine powered by debt, pre-sales, and belief. Evergrande simply drove that engine faster and harder than almost anyone else. And when regulators tightened, sales slowed, and buyers lost faith, the company did not just fail. It exposed the weakness in the entire design. That is the real lesson here. Crashes are rarely caused by one villain alone. More often, the real villain is a habit that turns into a culture, then into a system, and finally, into a national assumption. Evergrande was the biggest crack in the wall, which is why the world stared at it. But the wall was already under pressure, and that is what makes this story so unsettling. It was never just about a developer running out of money. It was about a growth model running out of trust. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. There are more like it.